So Chavismo, which is the name of the movement that is, Chavez and Maduro and etc. All of the people in their same party. It's called Chavismo. Chavismo swept. They didn't sweep up. They swept regional and legislative elections in Venezuela. So this was not a presidential election. Maduro was not up in this election. It was for regional and legislative. And Chavismo won rather handily. And part of the reason that they won so easily is because the opposition decided to boycott the election. That is an old tactic. It is something they're told to do by the U.S. empire because otherwise these elections where the Chavismo movement would still win, but it would just look far more, it would look like a real legitimate election. And you'd have to go, oh, the Venezuelan people actually support socialism and they support the trillions of dollars that go into oil and other resources. They support that going back to the people rather than going to a tiny handful of oligarchs. So they don't, the U.S. empire doesn't want it to look like a legitimate election. So they tell them to boycott it to try and say it wasn't legitimate. This is from People's Dispatch. Defying major disinformation and boycott campaigns by the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, 42.5% of the Venezuelan electorate went to the polls on Sunday to elect members of the National Assembly, governors, and mayors. In these elections, Chavismo secured a resounding victory over the opposition that did participate. The participating opposition obtained only one of the 24 governorships. Several weeks ago, a part of the Venezuelan opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, called for a boycott of the election, asking Venezuelans not to vote. This campaign is a recycled tactic of the far-right opposition, which seeks with a boycott to delegitimize Venezuelan democracy and accuse it of being fraudulent. In her account, her ex-Twitter account, Machado wrote, Venezuela disobeyed. And she then said the abstention rate was 85%. She's saying 85% of Venezuelans refused to vote, but that's actually false. She again called on the armed forces to disavow the constitutional power in Venezuela and thus open the way to transition in order and safety. So she's calling for a armed revolution in Venezuela, which generally, if you call for that, especially if you're already like an elected official or part of a political party, like if the Green Party in the U.S. were to say, hey, everybody, take up arms and take over the Capitol, they'd be arrested and they'd be called, called violence, called terrorism. So that's what would happen in the U.S. But in Venezuela, they're generally not arrested. I mean, I don't know if I think she's still in the country, but maybe I'm wrong. I know the last opposition leader fled the country, claiming he wasn't allowed to be there. But they let Juan Guaido run around the country calling for armed revolution like on a daily basis. They let him run around for years. I mean, he's still free as far as I know. Like so they never arrested him and put him in prison for running around demanding armed revolution. So she said 85% did not vote. However, the actual rate of participation was 42.5%, 5.5 million people. And that may sound like not many, only 42% voted, but I think the highest level the United States has ever had in a presidential election was 60%. In a midterm, so almost the same number almost the same amount as Venezuela in a midterm, which is what this was in Venezuela. 42.5% participation. The U.S., of course, jumped on the election to say it wasn't fair, it wasn't legit. They didn't let the opposition participate and shit like that, which is bullshit. And here's what they also said. This is at the State Department.
The State Department issued a security alert warning Americans against travel to Venezuela and bordering areas for any reason. Americans who travel to Venezuela or nearby border regions risk being wrongfully detained in prison for months or even years.
If you had to list a country that right now is grabbing up people who aren't from here and putting them in prisons, putting them in isolation chambers, shipping them back to countries they've never known, shipping them to El Salvadorian prisons, if you were to name a country, what would it be? Oh, the fucking United States. That's who's doing that. And she's like, oh, if you go to Venezuela, they'll totally arrest you. And unfortunately, I've never gotten to go to Venezuela, but I've had many friends go to Venezuela. And No, weren't arrested. Had a great time. Loved everyone. Found everyone incredibly kind and helpful. And basically anything the United States says about Venezuela, just whatever the opposite is, that is absolutely true. All of the time. All of the time. And if you need a reminder as to why the United States like despises Venezuela more than any other Latin American country. I mean, the United States has some hatred for certain Latin American countries, and they get upset with certain countries, and they've cooed many countries. They've lawfare cooed Brazil. They've cooed Bolivia recently. They've lawfare cooed Argentina. They've cooed in various ways Haiti. I'm not denying the United States wreaks all kind of havoc in Latin America, but it seems their number one hatred is for Venezuela. Why is that? Just when you have spare time, do a brave search for largest oil reserves by country. You will find that Venezuela has way more oil than any other country, even more than Saudi Arabia, even more than Iraq, even more than Iran. And the United States, two things. One is regularly talked about, which is that the United States does not like that in a socialist country, they're going to take the profits, if they were able to, of that oil and give it to the people. So the United States would hate that, right? They want the oil profits to go to corporations, to go to preferably U.S. corporations, to go to the ruling elite, to go to oligarchs. But beyond just that, if they allowed Venezuela to actually sell their oil, how would they sell it? They'd probably sell it outside of and they do sell it outside of the US dollar, outside of the petrodollar. It would be incredibly harmful to the US petrodollar to have Venezuela selling all of their oil outside of the dollar. So that is why Venezuela gets their number one level of hatred for Latin America, and why Iran right now has a lot of hatred.
I cannot emphasize enough the gravity of this warning. More U.S. nationals are currently wrongfully detained in Venezuela than in any other country.
And I wonder why that is. I bet it's not that the CIA has people there, that there's been numerous attempts to coup Venezuela, that I have no doubt that there's an endless array of CIA connected, CIA contract workers, etc., constantly trying to get into Venezuela. And that is probably the biggest reasons that there's people locked up in Venezuela. And just as a reminder of one of these moments, this is from like a year ago or so. Venezuela arrested Americans that were found to be trying to destabilize the country. And CNN wrote an article about it, and they changed the title. They kept the article the same, but here's the initial title. Venezuela says it has seized 400 U.S. rifles and arrested foreigners, Americans among them, over plot to destabilize the country. Wow, that's a big deal, right? Can you believe CNN covered that? CNN covered Americans with guns sneaking into Venezuela to try to destabilize them, coup them, etc. I'm surprised CNN covered that. Well, have no fear. It only took a few hours for CNN to change the title. The new title: U.S. says claims of CIA plot to kill Maduro are categorically false after Venezuela arrests 6 foreigners. So the same article, but new title says, oh yeah, it's all false. CIA says it's false. And as we all know, CIA always tells the truth, right? When was the last time the CIA lied, cheated, or stole? Except that Mike Pompeo said that there were classes to lie, cheat, and steal at the CIA.